Okay, good. And, I just want to mention that what you're doing is really, really important because not only do other students not recognize the importance of being financially literate, but a lot of adults don't either. And what you've done is really, really praiseworthy. Roberta and I couldn't be prouder of you two who started this group and the people who realize how important it is to participate in the group. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And what I would like to do today is we're going to go project ourselves to a few years in the future. Now, tell me, are you juniors right now? Are most people here juniors?
Yeah, everyone's here is a junior. We have a
Everyone's a junior. Okay,
Yeah.
so because of the pandemic, you have not experienced the financial reality fair that's done every year. You may have even heard about it before.
Yeah.
But this financial reality fair is it's a very good exercise. I think it's about a half day or a few hours. We were part of, instrumental in getting it started. We joined in with some of the parents. And what that does is, the way it works is each student is given a budget worksheet, and they are asked to project themselves into post-college year, like right after, the year you graduate college, if you go to college, and you are now working, and you can choose your career. It could be teacher, it could be a number of things, and you are assigned a certain salary. And what you do is you're going to go around from one table to another that's set up in this fair in the gym, and you're going to be asked to make decisions. You're going to be asked to make decisions about housing. Are you going to be living in an apartment? If you are, you're going to live alone, or you're going to share the apartment with somebody else. You're going to be asked about transportation. Are you going to need a car? And if so, what do you need? Can you get by with a used car? Are you going to be close to public transportation? And so on and so on. By the end of the circuit that you do, you're asked to come back to a table that's called, I think it's called the financial reality check. And what happens is that for each of those choices you make, there's an associated cost. And we add up those expenses based on what you've selected. And we compare it to your salary. And if your expenses exceed your salary, you have to go back, and you have to go back to some of those tables that you went to and make a different choice because you need to stay within your salary. So what I'm going to do today, it's sort of a preview of what you will probably be facing in the future. It's not really, it isn't the same as the financial reality fair. I hope that you will get a chance to experience that maybe as seniors. But this is just going to give you a little bit of a snapshot preview of the kinds of things that you will be needing to think about, expenses that you may have, and how do you make those choices, things to consider. So we're calling this Plan Your Financial Future. And again, this is just a preview. Not everything will apply to everybody. Okay, so let me get started. Most people, in the absence of some sort of education, find themselves to be confused financially. First of all, they've got bills to pay, they need insurance, do they have investments? And if so, what kind of investments? Do you have a savings account? And what is it? What are you saving for? What are your living expenses now? And what are they going to be? What kind of personal property do you have? Are you in any debt right now? Now, people who have just graduated may have college loan debt to pay back. They may have car transportation debt. So there's a number of things that they may be now needing to pay back. And maybe you have a checking account and you're trying to manage that for your day-to-day living expenses. So the person in the middle there is just bewildered and not really sure how do you make all that work together. Because the key is that all of these things have to work together. It's like pieces of a puzzle fitting together. And that's what this is, I'm hoping to at least give you a way, sort of a model, the way to think about this today. Oh, sorry. So let's first talk about the elements of financial planning. And we have it in a pyramid because the base or the foundation of the pyramid is sort of the place where we start, and then we go up from there to the tip. Now, this pyramid is not the same as what it would be, say, for your parents, because the parents are in a different position financially. They probably own a home, for instance. So they may have, and they may have other assets, savings and investments. So they are in a slightly different position, but I've sort of tried to narrow it down to the most practical ones that someone who's new to their careers might have to think about. So we start off with living expenses. That's at the base of the pyramid, because really, once you're out on your own, that's probably going to be the main thing you hit with is, okay, am I paying rent and how much is it going to be? What are my transportation costs, food costs, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these things. And then if you're being paid a salary, which you are, you have to think about savings and possibly investments. The goal is to try to save something. You know, they say pay yourself first. And if it's feasible, it's a really good idea to have some sort of a savings plan that may or may not include investments. And then next on the line is the taxes that you must pay based on your income. And there are other taxes that you must pay, sales tax, for instance. And there may be other taxes depending on what else you have going on. And the next level is what we call risk management. And risk management has a couple of different facets. For instance, you may have heard people speak about investments. And when you're making investments, there's a risk associated with investments. For instance, stock has more of a risk than certain bonds because bonds have a fixed return. And a stock may be highly risky. Another type of stock may not. So that's one aspect. But the aspect that we all have to consider when we're on our own is insurance, because there's many things that could happen. You could get into a car accident. You could have a major health crisis, and you have to be able to pay for whatever that accident causes, or you have to be able to pay for whatever health issues you may have. So insurance is about really managing risk, because all of those things are risks that you take simply for living. Next on the ladder, entertainment and leisure. That's known as a discretionary expense. The others are more fixed expenses because they're essential. But the discretionary expense here is all about having a good time, entertainment and leisure. And we'll again talk a little bit about that. And then the longer range element for financial planning is that once you're working, it's important to be thinking long-term about retirement. And fortunately, a lot of companies offer 401ks. And to the extent that it's possible, it's a good idea to contribute, if you can, to a 401k, because usually the companies will match up to, say, 2 or 3% of whatever you contribute. So it seems a long time away, but the time to start planning for retirement is now, when you start working. So let's start with living expenses. And this is all about what can I afford? So going through this scenario, say you're 22, 23 years old, and you have a great new job, and you're in the city, say, and you're renting an apartment, okay? Well, the first decision that you have to make is, am I going to be able to afford living there on my own, or do I need to have a roommate to help me afford the expenses? So this decision, so to speak, could allow you to spend, as little as $750 up to even more than $1,500, depending on where you live. If you live out in the suburbs, it might be less than $2,000. If you live in the city, it's going to be much more than $2,000. So this is just a range of expenses. And obviously, if you rent an apartment with someone else as a roommate, you're going to spend less. If you're alone, you're going to spend more. Depending on whether, again, you are living alone or you have a roommate, you could be spending $800 or $400 a week on groceries. If you have more than one roommate, you're probably going to be spending less. But if you're living alone, you're probably going to spend in the vicinity of $400 to $800 a week on groceries. I'm sorry, I meant a month. I'm sorry, not a week, a month. Okay. So that's another decision that's important. It has to do with how you choose to live and where can you afford to live. Again, this is another one. If you're living in an apartment alone, you could be spending $950, give or take a little bit, on utilities if it's not included in the rent. But if you're sharing an apartment, you could spend half of that. Now, these are just examples. It doesn't mean that this is the absolute number. I'm just giving you kind of an example of what it could look like. For insurance, you could be spending about $1,200 a month, believe it or not, because we're looking at all kinds of insurance, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. You'll have medical expenses. You may or may not use it, but you really should budget medical expenses, because if you're in good health, you may not need it. But what if something happens and, let's say you get into a car accident or you develop some sort of an illness? Well, you have some insurance, but that's not going to cover everything. So you have to be able to afford those out-of-pocket expenses for medical needs and prescriptions if you need that as well. Now, for clothing, this depends on the kind of a job you have. So you may have a job where you work in an office and people get dressed up in business attire. So your wardrobe is going to require suits, for instance, and if you're a woman, nice suits or dresses, business type dresses. If you work in a different field where it's all casual, you may not need to spend the money on those things, but you still need to have some attire that looks professional. And of course, if you work from home, like I do, you don't need a fancy wardrobe. But, when I do presentations and meetings with clients on Zoom, I have to look professional. So I may not spend as much on the clothes, but I do have to look professional. So I have to have a wardrobe that allows me to do that. So the clothing, it really is, it varies depending on the type of career you have. And of course, then you have your casual outfits for when you go out, separate, not working. Then you have personal care, and that includes things like haircuts, things like, if you have a beard, the grooming of the beard, other things that you do, you may have, when I say personal care, there may be, you include a gym because it's physical well-being, not just how you appear, but it's personal care is really about physical well-being. So there's a number of things that you probably spend on personal care. $75 may or may not be that number, but you have to figure out what it should be. And then your entertainment and leisure. If you like to go out to expensive restaurants, you have to set aside the money to do that. And if not, you may not have to set aside as much money, but it is something that you need to be prepared to spend and you need to plan for it. So under this scenario, this individual is looking at possibly $5,000 a month in living expenses. That may or may not be what you need, but this is just an example again. Savings and investments, how much do I need to meet my goals? Well, of course, your emergency, you should have an emergency fund, and that is down here in this yellow cloud. And the reason for having that is because you just never know what's going to happen. Again, you could get into an accident, your car could break down, something could happen if you own rather than rent, something could happen with something in the house where you suddenly have to spend money to have it repaired. There's a number of things. If you have a medical need, it's big because you have to go to the hospital, you may need an emergency fund to cover that expense. They say it should be the equivalent of 6 months worth of expenses. Some people just can't do that, but if you have something is better than nothing. Then you have a car. If you do indeed plan to have a car, depending on where you live, you may or may not. So you have to pay the expenses of a car. If you purchase the car, you may have monthly payments. You have to have maintenance costs and repairs and gas, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to have enough savings to cover those expenses. Education, you know, you may want to go on to further your education once you've graduated from your undergraduate cost education. So you may want to work and go to school part-time for a master's degree. So that's something you have to plan for and have savings set aside. If you want to take a vacation, you again have to be able to set aside the funding for that vacation. And if you decide at some point you want to buy a house, well, there again, you have to have enough money for the down payment. If you meet that special person and you decide you're going to get married, you have to plan and save for the wedding. And then, of course, as I said before, you have to be prepared for your retirement, which is quite a few years down the road, but investments can certainly help you be prepared. And that's where the 401k comes into play. Okay, come on, there you go. Oh, that went backwards, hold on. Okay, so the taxes, you know, you got to pay taxes whether you like it or not. And at the very least, when you're working, you're going to have income tax, and you're going to have federal income tax and state income tax. So a lot of people have it taken out of their pay, but sometimes that may not be enough. And you may find that when you file your income tax, you still owe money. So it's good to have some funds set aside to pay that amount that you might owe on your income tax, both at the state and the federal level. You also have sales tax. When you buy something, you pay sales tax, right? So that's another thing that you have to be prepared to cover as part of your living expenses. If you decide to buy a home, then you will owe real estate tax. And for people who live in Sharon, and you probably heard your parents complain that we have pretty high property taxes here in Sharon. So it's something that we have to be prepared to pay, and we have to set aside the money for it. Sometimes it's included in the monthly payment for the mortgage, and sometimes not. So it's just to be aware that if you do buy a home, you're going to have to pay property taxes. Let's say that you invest, that you've become pretty savvy in investments, and so you sell something. So you sell a stock, and the prices have gone very high now, and so you have a significant capital gains. You may or may not have to pay a capital gains tax. So you probably have a financial advisor to help you with this planning, but it is something that you may be able to minimize if you have a financial advisor, but still, you may still owe something for capital gains tax. And lastly, if you have a grandparent who has died, or if a parent dies, they most likely will have an estate plan which says, this is what this child or grandchild is going to get from my estate. Estate planning includes a will, but it may include trusts that specify how property is to be divided after you pass. So estate tax is something that you may run up against, depending on how much the value is of what you're receiving as a result of that death. So some of these may not be immediate, but others like income tax and sales tax certainly are. But everything has to be considered. Okay, now risk management, as I said, risk management does include investments, but for the purposes of necessities, which is mostly what we're talking about today, we're thinking about insurance, because that's the main purpose of insurance, is to protect you against risks, that the financial impact of risks. So for instance, you get into a car accident, and not only is your car damaged, but the other car is damaged as well because it was your fault. Well, what you're going to end up with is you're going to have to pay for your car to be repaired, okay? And you're going to have to pay for the damage to the other person's car if you're responsible for that accident. Well, you know, those things can get expensive, especially if it's a foreign car with expensive parts. So that's why people have car insurance, and especially people in your age bracket, and boys more than girls, you know, you have a higher risk of having an accident and being responsible. So you need insurance to protect you, both against the damage to your own car or injuries to yourself or a passenger, but also to damage to another car and injuries to the other drivers and passengers. So that's very important to have. If you have a home or rent an apartment, let's say you're renting an apartment, you may not need insurance for the home because the structure is the owner's responsibility, but you have belongings that you have with you in the apartment, and there's a risk of either damage to them or theft. So let's say you have an expensive sound system, for instance, an expensive video setup with it. If something were to cause damage, maybe a leaky roof or something, by having this insurance to cover your belongings, you will be able to recoup from the damage and be able to replace those things that you've lost. A lot of people have life insurance. Right now, you may be a little young for that, but as you get a little bit older, and especially if you have a family, people want to make sure that if anything happens to them, that their spouse and children will be able to continue living in the same manner that they have been. So life insurance is designed to help protect those who may be left behind should anything happen to you. Health insurance is absolutely essential because with medical costs today being so high, there is no way that most people will be able to cover their own medical costs. So health insurance does allow you to pay a certain monthly premium, and in return, you get your doctor's visits paid, or if you have to be hospitalized, you get that paid, prescriptions paid, not entirely, but you know, you have to contribute something towards those expenses, but the majority of the expense is covered by the insurance. Typically, a ratio is 80% covered by the insurance, and out of pocket, you might have to pay 20% of whatever that expense is. And believe it or not, disability is a greater risk for younger people than death is. So if someone has a choice, let's say they're in their 20s or even in their 30s, if someone has a choice because maybe they can't quite afford both, disability is more likely to get you than death is in that age bracket. So if you were to become injured or develop some sort of a critical illness that prevents you from working, you need to replace at least some of your income. First of all, because you need that income to continue living. And secondly, again, if you have others who depend on your income, it's going to be very important that they be able to continue. So sustaining some level of your income is going to be important. Entertainment and leisure, you know, you're going to have things you want to do for fun, and that's perfectly valid and it's important. But you may not be able to do all of them. You know, you may have to make some choices, whatever hobbies you may have, certain sports that you enjoy, either as a spectator or as a participant, other types of activities outdoor, things that you might do with your family that might have a cost associated with them. You might like music, either to play the music or to listen to concerts, and you may want to travel. So you have to be able to budget for those things. And, you know, again, some choices may be needed because these are discretionary expenses, not essentials. And again, retirement, there's a lot of things that are associated with retiring. You know, you want to be able to have enough funds in the future. And to do that, you have to plan now. So that's why financial planning is very important. And some people choose a financial advisor who has the expertise in retirement planning to assist them. What kind of housing are you going to need at the time? You know, if you're going to be in your late 60s or early 70s, and if you had kids, they're probably going to have left the house by now, being on their own. So you might want to downsize. You need to figure out, generally speaking, what your expenses may be. Travel, you may want to travel now that you're free of working and of kids. You might want to travel to visit your friends and family or entertain them. You need to consider the estate planning again, as I said before, because in the future, you're going to need to have a will and figure out how your property will be distributed to your heirs. You're going to have more medical needs in retirement than you do now, significantly more. So you have to be able to cover those expenses as a larger part of your budget. And if you can no longer live alone, you may need to have a plan for long-term care because that can be quite expensive. You may have grandparents now who live in a long-term care facility. So that is that need. And the whole goal here is to empower you financially to think about not only today, but the near future when you might be out in the working world, and then all the way through your life cycle until you retire. And that's where you become the driver here, and you're going to be in charge of your living expenses, savings and investments, planning for taxes, planning for the things that could go wrong and how you're going to cover them, being able to fit in some entertainment and leisure, and knowing that you will be able to retire in the future when the time comes. By planning today for tomorrow, you'll be in much better shape than people who don't plan. And now, if we have, I know we're running short, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or you can always email me at camille@thelawyermoneyandyou.com. So here I am again.
When do you think I should retire?
Who's asking that question?
Deputy Kari.
You're asking when should you retire?
Yeah.
Hey, if I were you, I'd want to retire next week, but chances are you're going to have to work for a while longer. It used to be that people retired at 65, but that not so much anymore, because 65 people are still young and vibrant in most cases. So they may want to say semi-retire, and then they might have a part-time job or pursue some sort of other interest. We don't see retirement anymore as a once and done deal where you're working and then all of a sudden you're not working. You may want to think about when you should retire, maybe not quite yet, but when you start working, you may want to think about it because it's a choice that you make.
Thank you.
Sure. What else? Did this make sense? Did you feel like you understood everything that we were going through?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, this was pretty good for especially for teenagers, because we're gonna have to start learning about this stuff in about 5-ish years or so, because we'll start our careers and stuff. But
that's very true.
yeah, this was very useful.
Okay. Anybody else have comments or feedback? Okay, well, if you think of anything, don't hesitate to send an email, because, with our involvement in the Law, Your Money, and You, the whole purpose is to provide financial education to all age groups, adults and people who will soon become adults. And so we're really interested in helping you get that clarity that will allow you to be successful in the future. And that's why we do what we do. And we're very happy that you're doing what you do.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
You are very welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Our other members are going to see this and
Okay.
they'll use it too.
All right. Very good.
All right.
So you can, I guess you can go ahead and close the meeting now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you, Jen.
goodbye
Thank you
now.
for joining us.